The van had been the church's for 9 years, bought used from the diocese at 32,000 miles and maintained since with the particular care of something that belongs to everyone and therefore requires someone specific to be responsible for it. It was white with a small Calvary Baptist Church decal on the rear door and the church's Reed Moore Street address in smaller text beneath it. The decal had been applied by a member of the congregation named George Tillman, who was a sign maker by trade, and who had said he would do it for free, because if the church van was going out into the world, it should be identifiable as a church van. Harold had said, "Thank you, George." George had said, "It's what I do." Harold had said, "I know. That's why I thanked you." That someone was Reverend Harold James Whitfield, who had been the pastor of Calvary Baptist Church on Reedmore Street for 23 years, and who serviced the van himself at the church's small garage, every 3 months on schedule. He had learned to service vehicles the way he had learned everything useful in his life from his grandfather, who had run a service station in rural Georgia for 40 years, and who had said that a machine you cannot care for is a machine you cannot trust, and that you should not trust something you cannot care for, and that this applied to vehicles and to people in equal measure. He was 62 years old. He had a face that his congregation described among themselves as a face of patience, not the patience of someone waiting to speak, but the patience of someone who has already heard enough of a situation to know what it requires and is taking the time to respond to it correctly. He was broad-shouldered and deliberate in his movements with the particular physical economy of a man who has spent decades managing his own presence in rooms where the situation required him to take up only the space that was appropriate. He wore his ministry collar on Sundays and Wednesdays, and on the Saturday trips, because he had found that the collar was a signal that organized people's understanding of who he was before he said a word, and that organizing people's understanding in advance was generally useful, and that on the Saturday trip specifically, it reassured the children in ways that ordinary clothing did not. He had gone into the ministry at 32 after a decade as a high school history teacher in the Reedmore district, and an 8-year involvement with the Reedmore Community Youth Program that had made it clear to him that the work he was called to do required a different infrastructure. He had taught at Reedmore High for 9 years American history with a focus on primary sources and on the specific skill of reading what the document actually says versus what people claim it says. He had sent in 9 years over 400 students into the world with that skill and with the habit of asking, "Show me the document." He believed it was the most useful thing he had taught anyone. He still believed it. He had enrolled in seminary at 31, had been ordained at 33, and had accepted the call to Calvary Baptist in the same year, where his predecessor, Reverend Robert Carnes, had been pastor for 31 years, and whose photograph still hung in the narthex with the specific settled dignity of a person whose long presence in a place has made the place partially theirs. Harold Whitfield intended to earn his photograph. He was 23 years into the earning. His wife Miriam had been the first member of Calvary Baptist he had met. She had been on the search committee that had reviewed his candidacy, and she had asked him at the candidate dinner what he believed the church owed to the community outside its walls. He had said everything. She had said be specific. He had spent 20 minutes being specific. She had voted for him at the committee meeting. They had been married 4 years later. Miriam Whitfield taught 3rd grade at Westbrook Elementary and had over 20 years of their marriage referred 7 families to the Good Shepherd Partnership and had organized through her school's parent network 14 book donations to the home's library. She came on the Saturday trips 3 or 4 times a year. The children knew her by name and by the specific fact that she always brought the best snacks, not store-bought snacks, but made snacks the kind that require preparation, the kind that tell children they were thought about before they arrived. She had made oatmeal cookies for the September trip. They were in a bag in the van's rear compartment. Harold had remembered them at the museum parking lot and had distributed them before the children went inside so they would not be eating cookies in the geological timeline gallery. Miriam had been home on the Saturday of the Route 7 stop. Harold had called her from the museum parking lot at 10:19 after the cookies were distributed and the children were inside. He had said, "I need to tell you what happened on Route 7 this morning." She had said, "Tell me." He had told her. She had said, when he finished, "Are the children all right?" He had said, "They're in the museum." She had said, "Then they're all right." She had said, "File the complaint on Monday." He had said, "I know." She had said, "I'll make cookies for the October trip." He had said, "Make the oatmeal ones." She had said, "I always make the oatmeal ones." He had said, "I know. I just like saying it." The van served Calvary Baptist's outreach ministry, and specifically the Good Shepherd Children's Home Partnership, which Harold had established in his 4th year as pastor. The Good Shepherd Children's Home was a licensed residential facility for children in state care 9 blocks from the church on Vance Avenue. Harold had first visited it after a member of his congregation mentioned that the home was looking for community partners. He had visited on a Thursday afternoon in February and had walked through the common room and the small playground and the dormitory wing, and had come home and sat in his study and had written one sentence in his journal: "This is where the work is." He had been partnering with the home for 19 years. The partnership included weekly visits, a summer reading program, holiday celebrations, a summer camp sponsorship, and most importantly for the children who participated in it, a monthly trip that the children called the Saturday trip, which was what they called it, because it happened on the last Saturday of every month, and because it was a trip, and they were children, and children name the things that matter to them in the most direct available language. The Saturday trip had developed its own tradition and its own rhythm over 16 years. It went to different places: the Science Museum, the Botanical Gardens, the city's Art Museum, a farm outside the city that had a corn maze in October, the state park to the north where the children had seen their first waterfall, the public library for a program the children's librarian had designed specifically for the Good Shepherd group, and which included a behind-the-scenes tour of the acquisitions room that the children talked about for weeks afterward. Harold planned each trip a minimum of 3 months in advance, because the advance planning meant the museum or park or library could arrange something specific for the group, rather than absorbing them into the general public program. He had found over 16 years that the difference between a Saturday trip that was good and one that was transformative was almost always the specific preparation that the host had made for the children. He had taken them in his personal car first, which had accommodated 3 children and required multiple trips and created a logistical complexity that he had accepted as the cost of the beginning. Then in a borrowed van from another church which had accommodated 8 children and which the other church had been generous about lending sometimes on short notice. Then in the church van, when the church had bought the church van, which had accommodated 12 children and had made the Saturday trip possible at its current scale. He had taken different children each month as they aged through the home's population, and some of the children had grown up and aged out of the home, and had come back as young adults and volunteered to help with the Saturday trip, which was a form of gratitude that Harold found more meaningful than most things he had been thanked for in 23 years of ministry. He kept a list in a notebook in his desk of every child who had been on a Saturday trip. The list had 217 names on it. He knew the names. On the last Saturday of September, Harold Whitfield arrived at the Good Shepherd Children's Home parking lot at 8:45. He always arrived 15 minutes before the 9 o'clock departure, because 15 minutes was enough time to load the children in an organized way and to account for the variability of 12 children getting ready on a Saturday morning, which was a different kind of variability from 12 children getting ready on a weekday morning, and which Harold had learned to plan for. He had the van serviced the previous Thursday. The oil was changed, the tire pressure was correct, the fluid levels were all where they needed to be, the windshield was clean. He drove a church van carrying children. It was always correct. The children came out of the home at 8:52, which was 8 minutes before departure. They had their permission slips and their packed lunches and the particular energy of children who know they are going somewhere good and are managing themselves because they have learned over Saturday trips that managing yourself is a requirement of going somewhere good. They had the contained excitement of the experienced and the uncontained excitement of the new. The children who had been on Saturday trips before walked to the van with the easy confidence of people who know what comes next. And the children who had not been before walked with their eyes a little wider and their steps a little more uncertain, looking at the older children for information about how to be. The children ranged in age from 7 to 14, and they loaded into the van in the order that Harold had established over 16 years, youngest in the middle rows, oldest in the first 2 rows, Marcus in the first row on the left. They each had a permission slip signed by the home's director, Mrs. Celeste Brewer, and a packed lunch in a bag, and the particular look of children who have claimed their seat and are ready. Lily sat in the second row on the right. It was her first Saturday trip. She held her lunch bag in her lap with both hands and looked out the window as Harold pulled out of the parking lot. She did not know where the Natural History Museum was, but she knew it was far enough that they were going on the highway, because Marcus had told her, and she looked at the highway on-ramp with the expression of a child for whom the highway itself is an event. The oldest Marcus was 14 and had been on 7 Saturday trips. He sat in the first row on the left side, which was where he always sat, and he helped the younger ones with their seatbelts when the seatbelt mechanism was the kind that required a specific angle to engage. The youngest Lily was 7, and it was her first Saturday trip, and she sat in the second row on the right side and held the bag lunch in her lap with both hands and looked out the window with the full attention of a child for whom the world outside the van window is still a place of continuous revelation. Harold had told the children they were going to the city's Natural History Museum, and the announcement made at the home the previous Wednesday during the regular weekly visit had been received with the particular mix of enthusiasm and careful reserve that children in residential care have learned to bring to anticipation. Enough openness to be genuinely excited. Enough caution to protect against disappointment if the thing did not happen. Marcus had said on Wednesday, I looked it up. The geological timeline gallery is 4 billion years in one room. Harold had said, that's correct. Marcus had said, that seems impossible. Harold had said, go see for yourself. He had arranged through Dr. Patricia Huang a special guided tour that she had developed specifically for residential care children over 11 years of collaboration with various homes in the city. The program began with the geological timeline and ended in the North American Mammals Hall, and it was designed to produce in children who spent most of their time within a small geographic radius the specific experience of scale of time and space and the variety of life that Harold believed all children needed, and that some children in their circumstances had limited access to. He had been bringing children to Dr. Huang's tours for 9 years. She had modified the program each year based on what she had observed the children responding to, which was how good educators work, not from a fixed curriculum, but from the ongoing evidence of what actually reaches the people in front of them. He drove the van on Route 7, which was the most direct route to the museum from the Reedmore neighborhood. Route 7 was a 2-lane state road through the older part of the city before it opened onto the highway interchange, and Harold had driven it 47 times in the past 4 years, and knew it with the specific familiarity of regular use. He drove at 61 miles per hour, 2 miles per hour above the posted limit, which was the speed of traffic on that section of Route 7, and which he had been driving for 4 years. The lights came on at 8 minutes past 9. Harold saw them in the mirror and felt the specific thing that a person feels when they see lights behind them with 12 children in the vehicle and 17 minutes of carefully managed schedule between them and a 10 o'clock tour. He felt it, and he set it aside, and he pulled the van to the shoulder with the full care of a person who is responsible for 12 children. And he turned on the hazard lights, and he turned around. Officer Kevin Strand was 30 years old, 4 years on the force assigned to the Route 7 patrol, which covered the two-lane section between Reedmore and the interchange. He had grown up 20 miles outside the city, in a township that had a single black family in it for most of his childhood. He had joined the department because 2 of his cousins were officers, and because it seemed at 26 like a clear path to a stable career, and because the physical and tactical requirements of the academy were not intimidating to him. He had passed the academy without distinction in any category. He had been assigned to Route 7 for 14 months. He had pulled over 11 vehicles in the previous 3 weeks, 8 of which had been for documented traffic violations that had produced citations, speeding equipment deficiencies, expired registration, and 3 of which had been for what his incident reports described as equipment checks. Of the 3 equipment checks, all 3 involved black drivers. All 3 had been resolved without citation. All 3 had taken between 12 and 40 minutes. Of the 11 total stops, Strand had issued citations to 4 verbal warnings to 3 and written reports on 4. The written reports on the 4 that were not citations or warnings described the basis for the stop in language that, when read in sequence, described the same basis for stops that had not produced any documented violation. The vehicle's behavior in traffic was inconsistent with surrounding traffic. The phrase appeared in all 4 reports. It appeared in the same position in all 4 reports. It was the same phrase in the same position describing 4 different vehicles driven by 4 different people on 4 different days with 4 different results, all of which were no violation found. He ran the van's plates when it passed his position. The plates came back registered to Calvary Baptist Church, Reedmore Street. He noted that the registration was current and the insurance was current. He ran Harold's license when he pulled the van over. The license came back clean, no violations, no warrants valid through 2027. Harold had pulled the van to the shoulder of Route 7 with the particular careful precision of a man who is responsible for 12 children and who understands that the shoulder of a state road requires the vehicle to be fully off the travel lane. He had turned on the van's hazard lights. He had looked at the mirror and seen 12 faces looking back at him, some already anxious, some not yet understanding what the lights in the mirror meant. Lily in the second row putting down her lunch bag to look. He turned around to the children. He said in the specific, calm voice he had been developing and refining for 23 years, "We've been stopped by a police officer. I'm going to talk to him, and we'll be on our way shortly." He said, "Everyone stay in your seats and stay calm." He looked at Marcus when he said it, because Marcus was 14, and because Marcus was the one who would set the register for the younger children. If Marcus was calm, the younger ones would follow Marcus's calm. The way they followed Marcus into the van, the way they followed him in the museum halls, the way children follow the person who has been where they are going and is not afraid. Marcus nodded. Harold said, "Thank you, Marcus." He said it so that all the children heard the thanks, so that Marcus would know in front of the group that his steadiness mattered. Then he turned back to the window. Strand had approached the driver's side. He had looked into the van. He had seen the 12 children. He had paused 1 second to the pause of a person who has seen something they had not anticipated and is processing it. He had said, "Do you know why I stopped you?" Harold said, "I don't, officer. I was keeping with the flow of traffic." Strand said you were going 63 and a 60. Harold said I was going 61. He said it without heat because heat was not the correct instrument. He said I'd be glad to pay a citation if that's the determination. He said I have 12 children in this vehicle who are on a church-sponsored trip to the Natural History Museum. I'd like to get them there on time for their guided tour, which is scheduled for 10 o'clock. Adios. Strand looked into the van again. He was looking at it the way a person looks at something that does not fit the framework they brought with them to the encounter. 12 children in seats with their seatbelts fastened and their packed lunches and their permission slips clipped to the console visor did not fit the framework of the approach. He said, "Whose children are these?" Harold said they are children from the Good Shepherd Children's Home on Vance Avenue. We have a 19-year partnership with the home through Calvary Baptist Church. This is our monthly educational trip. Strand said, "Do you have documentation for the children?" Harold said yes. He reached for the permission slip folder that was in the console between the seats. He held it out. Strand took it. He opened it and looked through the 12 permission slips, each one signed by Celeste Brewer, and stapled to the child's identification card with the child's photograph and date of birth. The folder was organized in a clear plastic cover with the church's name and the date of the trip on the front. Harold had prepared it the previous Wednesday. He prepared it every month. Strand said, "Step out of the vehicle." Harold said, "I'd prefer not to step out of the vehicle with the children inside." He said, "I'm happy to provide any documentation you need from the window." Strand said, "Sir, step out of the vehicle." Harold looked at Marcus. Marcus was sitting straight and quiet and watching. Harold said to the children, and specifically to Marcus, "I'm going to step outside for a moment. Mr. Harold is fine." He turned back to the window. He stepped out. He stood on the shoulder of Route 7 with the van at his back and the traffic moving past and the September morning in full light and the hazard lights blinking in the regular rhythm of hazard lights. He was in his church clothes, a dark suit, a white shirt, the collar of his ministry visible, the small cross pin on his lapel that had been his grandfather's and that he had worn since his grandfather's death in 2009. Strand said, "Where are you taking these children?" Harold said, "To the Reedmore City Natural History Museum for a 10 o'clock guided tour with Dr. Patricia Huang, the museum's educational programs coordinator." He said, "I have documentation for the tour as well." He said, "I arranged it 11 months ago and have the confirmation in the van's console if you'd like to see it." Strand said, "How do you know these children?" Harold said, "I am the pastor of Calvary Baptist Church on Reedmore Street. We have a 19-year partnership with the Good Shepherd Children's Home on Vance Avenue. We do a monthly educational trip with children from the home. This is the September trip." Strand said, "Who authorized this?" Harold said, "The home's director, Celeste Brewer. Her authorization is in the signed permission slips you are holding." He said, "If you'd like her contact information, I have it on my phone." Strand looked at the permission slips again. He looked at Harold. He looked at the van. He said, "I'm going to need you to step to the rear of the vehicle." Harold said, "Officer, I have 12 children in this van who are watching everything that is happening." He said it the way he said things from the pulpit on the Sundays, when the sermon was about bearing witness, not loudly, not with anger, but with the specific weight of a sentence that has been considered before it has been said. He said, "I will cooperate with any lawful request you make. I would ask you to consider what these children are being asked to observe." Strand said, "Step to the rear of the vehicle." Harold walked to the rear of the van. He stood at the rear doors. The van's back window faced the traffic. Through the back window, he could see the children in their seats. He could see Lily in the second row, who had put down her lunch bag and was watching him with the specific expression of a 7-year-old who is trying to understand something and does not have the context to understand it, which is an expression that Harold recognized from 23 years of working with children, and which was one of the expressions that was hardest to be the cause of. He stood. He breathed. The traffic moved past on Route 7, the cars and the trucks and the buses and the vehicles of a Saturday morning people going about their Saturday. The September air was cool and clear. He could hear faintly the hazard lights clicking. He looked at the elm trees on the far side of the shoulder. He thought about the geological timeline in the museum, the 4-billion-year record in one room. He thought about the very small position of a Tuesday in September in that record. He thought about what he had said to the children. Mr. Harold is fine. He intended to make that true by the time he was back in the driver's seat. He thought about what he was going to write in the complaint. He thought about the 4 pages it would take to say everything accurately. He thought 4 pages is not very many pages for 29 minutes on the shoulder of Route 7. He thought, I will use all 4 pages. Strand was at the side of the van talking into his radio. Harold could hear the radio exchange the license check, the registration check, the route number, the time. He could hear the response, which was clean on all counts. He waited. Something was happening inside the van. Harold could not hear it through the closed windows and the traffic noise of Route 7, but he could see the children through the back window shifting in their seats. He could see the specific shift that happens in a group of children when something they don't understand is happening to an adult. They trust the movement toward each other, the younger ones leaning toward the older ones sitting straighter and trying to project a steadiness they may or may not have felt. He could see Marcus turn and say something to the children in the second row. He could see Lily, who had been watching Harold, begin to cry. Not dramatically, not loudly, the silent kind of crying that children do when they do not want to make it worse. She was 7 years old, and it was her first Saturday trip, and her pastor was standing at the back of the van on the side of a road, and she did not understand why, and the not understanding was producing. In her 7-year-old face, the expression that adults who work with children in residential care find the hardest to witness, which is the expression of a child who has learned that adults disappear unexpectedly, and that the disappearing does not always have a reason she can find. The van's side door opened. It opened from the inside, which was possible because the doors were not locked, because Harold never locked the children, in which was both a safety practice and a statement of a philosophy that he had held for 19 years of this work. Marcus got out first. He was 14 years old and 6 feet tall, with the particular combination of adolescent height and childhood face that belongs to 14-year-olds who are growing fast. He stepped out onto the shoulder of Route 7, and he looked at the situation, and he looked at Harold. He said, "Pastor Whitfield." He said it as an address and a question at the same time. Harold said, "Marcus, get back in the van." Marcus said, "Lily's crying." Harold said, "I know. Get back in the van." Behind Marcus came the other children. They came out in the order of their seats, some of them helping the younger ones step down from the van, some of them standing in small groups on the shoulder of Route 7, some of them crying quietly, the way Lily was crying, some of them with the specific scared stillness of children who have had adults behave unpredictably around them before, and who recognize the register. 12 children stood on the shoulder of Route 7 in the September morning sunlight. Their packed lunches were in the van. Their permission slips were with the officer. Dr. Patricia Huang was expecting them at 10 o'clock at the Natural History Museum 9 miles down the road. Harold looked at his children. He used the word his not as a legal or custodial claim, but in the way that the people who do this work use it, the children in my care, the children whose safety I am responsible for, the children whose trust I am given on Saturday mornings, and do not take lightly. He looked at them standing on the shoulder of Route 7, several of them crying quietly. Marcus standing straight and watching Harold, Lily with her lunch bag pressed against her chest. A girl named Jasmine, who was 9 years old, holding the hand of a 6-year-old named Darius, who was standing with his sneakers at the very edge of the white shoulder line. Harold said quietly to the group, "Step back from the road's edge." Darius stepped back. Harold looked at each of them. He looked at them the way he had looked at congregations for 23 years. The specific attentive looking that says, "I see you. I am here. This is temporary. We are going to be all right." He looked at each of them. A passing car slowed when it saw 12 children on the shoulder of a state road with a church van and a police officer. Another car slowed. A third car pulled onto the shoulder 50 feet back from the van and stopped. The driver was Margaret Fielding, 67, white-haired, a retired school principal from the district north of the city. She rolled down her window and called out, "Are those children all right?" Strand looked at the children. He looked at Harold. He looked at Margaret Fielding. He looked at the 12 children standing on the shoulder of Route 7, several of them crying, looking at their pastor, who was standing at the rear of the van with his crosspin on his lapel and his hands at his sides and his eyes on his children. Harold looked at the 12 children standing on the shoulder of Route 7. He looked at Lily, who had stopped crying but whose face still showed the residue of it. He looked at Marcus, who was standing straight and watching Harold with the specific, focused steadiness of a 14-year-old who is holding himself together for the younger ones. He looked at the woman who had stopped on the shoulder 50 feet back. The white-haired woman in her 60s who had rolled down her window and called, "Are those children all right?" He looked at the passing traffic slowing. He looked at all of it in the specific, compressed way that a person looks at a situation when they have processed everything it contains and are deciding how to act. He said to Strand quietly, "Officer." He said, "You have my license. You have my registration. You have 12 signed permission slips from the licensed director of the Good Shepherd Children's Home. You have the museum's tour confirmation in the van's console. There is no violation here." He said, "I have 12 children standing on the shoulder of a state road who need to be back in that van." He said, "Please return my documents so I can get them in the van and to their tour." He said it with the complete quiet of a man who has spent 23 years learning how to say the necessary thing in the right register. Not a demand, not an argument, not a performance. A statement of what was true and what was needed made in the presence of 12 children who were watching every moment of it, and in the presence of a woman on the shoulder 50 feet back who was watching, and in the presence of 3 lanes of slowing traffic on Route 7, and in the presence of a body camera that was recording every word. Strand said after a pause that lasted long enough to be noticed by every child on the shoulder and by Margaret Fielding in her stopped car 50 feet back, "Here are your documents." He handed back the license. He handed back the permission slip folder. He said, "You're free to go." He said it without additional words. He said it with the expression of a person who has arrived at the end of something and is aware at the arrival that the thing they have arrived at the end of has not resolved the way they anticipated when they began. Harold said, "Thank you, officer." He said it because he said thank you when it was appropriate to say thank you, and because ending the encounter with courtesy was the correct choice both morally and practically, and because in front of 12 children who were going to process what they had witnessed for a long time, how the encounter ended mattered as much as anything. He said, "Marcus, help everyone back into the van." Marcus turned and began doing exactly that. He put a hand on the shoulder of the 7-year-old next to him and said, "Okay." He said, "Back in the van." He said it the way Harold would have said it, with the specific composed authority of someone who is responsible for the children around him. The children moved back toward the van. Marcus helped the younger ones with the step. He got in last after he had counted 11 children in their seats. Harold went to Lily. She was still on the shoulder, not crying anymore, but with the residue of it on her face and her lunch bag held against her chest with both arms instead of her hands. He crouched down so that he was at her level. He said, "Lily." She looked at him. He said, "We're going to the museum. We're going to see things that are 4 billion years old." She said, "Are you okay, Pastor Harold?" He said, "I'm fine." He said, "Are you okay?" She said, "I think so." He said, "Good. Then let's get back in the van." He helped her up the step. He walked around to the driver's side. He got in. He looked at the children in the rearview mirror. 12 faces, some still damp. Marcus in the first row sitting straight, Lily with her lunch bag in her lap, again looking out the window. He turned forward. He started the van. He checked the mirror. He signaled. He pulled back onto Route 7. He drove at 60 miles per hour, exactly the speed limit, because that was what the situation called for now. The woman in her 60s who had stopped on the shoulder had pulled out when the van pulled out. She followed the van for 3 exits on the highway and then took a different turn. But she had stopped. She had rolled down her window. She had asked if the children were all right. Harold had seen it. He thought about it on the drive to the museum. He thought, that is what people do when they see children on the side of a road. They stop. He thought that is the right thing. He thought some people still do the right thing when they see it. He checked his watch when he pulled back onto Route 7938. He had been stopped for 29 minutes. He calculated the route from the current position 26 minutes to the museum at the current speed, which would put them at the museum at 10:04. He called Dr. Patricia Huang at 9:41. He said, "Dr. Huang, this is Reverend Whitfield. We had an unexpected delay on Route 7. We will be approximately 17 minutes late for the 10 o'clock tour. He said, I apologize for the inconvenience. She said, Reverend Whitfield, I'll hold the tour. She had said, Are the children all right? He had paused for 1 second. He had said they will be. She had said then, I'll be here when you arrive. They arrived at the Natural History Museum at 10:17. Dr. Patricia Huang was waiting in the museum lobby with the particular patient composure of an educator who has spent 11 years working with children from residential care, and who understands that the path from where those children start to where she wants to take them always involves obstacles, and that the job is to be there when they arrive. She had a bright green museum educator lanyard, and the expression of a person who was genuinely glad they had come. The geological timeline was everything Harold had hoped it would be. Dr. Huang had a way of presenting the timeline that made it comprehensible to a 7-year-old and genuinely interesting to a 14-year-old. She did it through stories, through specific examples, through the particular fossils and formations that made abstract geological time suddenly specific and real. A 4-billion-year-old rock that had been underwater during the Cambrian. A fossil of a creature that had no living relatives and had no name in any language until a scientist found it and named it 30 years ago. A layer of soil in the exhibit case that marked the specific moment 66 million years ago, when everything above the line lived in a world that was about to end, and everything below the line lived in a world before the ending. The children, even the ones whose faces still carried the residue of what had happened on Route 7, became absorbed by the scale of it. By the 4-billion-year timeline that made the history of human beings look like the final fraction of the final line, by the rocks and the fossils, and Dr. Huang's voice explaining how old things leave records in the things they leave behind. The children who had been crying on the shoulder of Route 7 were, by the time they reached the mammal hall, running their fingers along the replica mammoth's ribs and asking whether the woolly mammoths were really as big as they looked, or whether the exhibit made them look bigger. Marcus was explaining to the child next to him how the carbon dating worked. He had read about it the previous week, because Harold had told the children in advance what the museum contained, and had encouraged them to look things up before they arrived, and Marcus had looked things up. Lily asked 6 questions during the tour. Dr. Huang answered all 6 and said when Lily paused that she should keep asking because the questions were good ones. Lily said my pastor says the same thing. Dr. Huang looked at Harold standing at the back of the group. She said, your pastor sounds like a wise person. Harold said the credit belongs to the questions. He stood at the back of the group for the full tour. He stood and watched the children watching the world opening up to them in the specific way that museums do it quietly, with the patience of things that have been there for a very long time. He thought about what had happened on Route 7. He thought about the formal complaint he was going to file, which he had already decided he was going to file, because the filing was the correct response, and the correct response was what he did. He thought about Marcus at 14 getting out of the van because Lily was crying. He thought about Lily in the second row, holding her lunch bag with both hands, who was now running her finger along the mammoth's rib and asking whether it was cold in the Ice Age all the time, or just in some places. He thought about the 217 names in the notebook in his desk. He thought about the names that would come after them. He thought the work is always still there. He thought, I'm still here to do it. Celeste Brewer, the home's director, had been managing the Good Shepherd Children's Home for 14 years. She was 54, a licensed social worker with a master's in nonprofit management, and she had built the home's programs from a place where children waited for placement into a place where children were known by their history, their preferences, their fears, their specific capacities and gifts. She had spent 14 years building this, and Harold Whitfield had been part of the building for 13 of those 14 years. She valued the partnership with Calvary Baptist in the precise, calibrated way that she valued everything that affected her children's lives, with the understanding that it was irreplaceable and that its absence would cost the children something that could not be easily restored. She had received Harold's call at 2:15 on Saturday afternoon. She had listened to the account without interrupting. She had said, "Are the children all right?" Harold had said, "They're all right." He had said Marcus was very good with the younger ones. She had said, "I know." She had said, "I'll write a statement." She meant, "I will document this accurately and completely, and it will be in the record." Harold had said, "I know you will." She wrote 4 pages. She described the Saturday trip program and its 19-year history. She described the specific children who had been on the September trip, their ages, the ones for whom it was their first Saturday trip, and in Lily's case, the specific significance of the experience given Lily's circumstances, which Celeste described with the precision of a professional who understood both what the information communicated and what was appropriate to include. She described what Harold had told her about the stop and what the children had told her when they returned. She had spoken with each child individually on Sunday morning, which was her practice after any unusual event, to assess their state and give them the space to name what they had experienced. She documented what each child had said. She attached the documentation to the statement. The formal complaint was filed the following Monday morning. Harold had written it himself, 4 pages clear and organized and fully documented in the specific writing of a man who has spent 23 years producing sermons, which are documents that must be both accurate and humane. He had attached the museum's tour confirmation, showing the original 10 o'clock appointment and the new arrival time of 10:17, with Dr. Huang's notation that the tour had been held. He had attached Celeste Brewer's 4-page statement. He had attached the permission slips. He had called 2 of the other drivers who had stopped on Route 7, the white-haired woman in her 60s, whose name was Margaret Fielding, and a man who had stopped behind her whose name was Thomas Reyes, who was a retired county social worker and who had stopped because he had seen 12 children on the shoulder of a state road and had considered what that meant, and had decided that stopping was what the situation required. Both had submitted written accounts. Margaret Fielding had said in her account, "I have never seen anything like it, and I am 67 years old." Thomas Reyes had said, "I have worked with children in care for 31 years, and I am telling you what I saw meant something to those children, and that meaning will not go away quickly." The complaint was filed with the city's Office of Professional Standards, and simultaneously with the state's Department of Motor Vehicles Oversight Board, which had jurisdiction over traffic stop conduct on state roads, and with the state's Child Welfare Advisory Office, because Harold had included a separate section in the complaint specifically addressing the impact of the stop on children in residential care, which was a population he knew well and whose circumstances he understood required specific consideration. He had written that section last at 1 a.m. on Sunday after the other 3 sections were complete, and it was the section he had written most carefully. Strand's supervisor reviewed the body camera the same week. The body camera showed 29 minutes of the stop. He reviewed the dash camera which had captured the moment the van came into range. He could see the van on the dash camera footage driving in the lane, and he could see no behavior that was inconsistent with the surrounding traffic. He pulled all 11 prior stops from the system. He arranged them chronologically and read them in sequence, which was the first time all 11 had been in sequence in a single reading. The pattern in the 3 equipment checks was visible in the third stop's report, which used the same phrase in the same position as the first and second, which meant the phrase was not describing observed behavior but was being used as a template for documenting stops that did not have a documented basis. He had been in law enforcement for 19 years, and he had learned over those years that some things are easier to see when you are looking for them. He had also learned that whether you are looking for them is a choice, and that the choice is itself a matter of record. He wrote in his preliminary notes the 3 equipment check stops when read with the current complaint document a pattern of stops without documented basis targeting black drivers on Route 7. He noted the date. He initiated the investigation. Strand was suspended for 20 days without pay. The 3 equipment check stops read with the current complaint as a pattern produced a sustained finding that was placed in his personnel record as a permanent notation. He was removed from the Route 7 patrol and assigned to administrative duty pending a mandatory evaluation. His supervisor was required to complete a supplemental documentation training within 90 days because the supervisor's review of the 11 stops had revealed that the supervisor had co-signed 4 of them as reviewed without identifying the pattern in the equipment check descriptions. A pattern that should have been visible on the second review if the second review had read the reports in sequence rather than individually. The supplemental training requirement was noted in the supervisor's personnel file. It was not a finding of misconduct. It was a requirement for growth. The distinction was recorded precisely. The State Oversight Board sent a letter to the department's Chief of Patrol Operations, noting that the documentation from the 14-passenger vehicle stop on September 28th, specifically the body camera evidence of 12 children standing on the shoulder of a state road, constituted a child welfare concern that the board was referring to the state's Child Welfare Advisory Office for review. The Child Welfare Advisory Office acknowledged the referral and initiated its own review, which produced a set of recommendations for child welfare protocols during traffic stops involving vehicles carrying minor passengers. One of the recommendations was adopted into the state patrol training curriculum within 6 months. It required that any stop involving a vehicle carrying 5 or more minor passengers be subject to a documented basis standard, meaning the officer had to document in real time the specific articulable basis for the stop before approaching the vehicle. The documentation requirement made the pattern of stops that Strand had been conducting over the previous 3 weeks significantly harder to execute because documenting in real time the basis for a stop that has no basis produces in the documentation itself the evidence of its own invalidity. A second recommendation, which was adopted in the following year's training cycle, required officers assigned to routes that served residential areas with significant residential care facility populations to complete a training module on the specific population of children in residential care, who they were, what their circumstances typically involved, how uniformed law enforcement authority might be experienced by children who had particular histories with adult authority. Harold Whitfield contributed 2 paragraphs to the curriculum materials for this module at the request of the state's Department of Public Safety, which had read his complaint and his sermon notes and had contacted him through Calvary Baptist Church office. He had said yes immediately. He had written the 2 paragraphs carefully, the way he wrote everything for accuracy first and then for the human meaning of the accuracy. He had written these children have already been through something. What they need from the world they encounter is evidence that the world can be trusted. When uniformed authority is the thing that tells them the world cannot be trusted, the damage is specific and it is significant. Consider what you are communicating and to whom before you communicate it. The department had used the 2 paragraphs verbatim. Harold had not been told this. He found out when a training officer who had completed the module called the church office and asked if she could speak with the Reverend Whitfield, who had written the curriculum language. Harold had said that was me. She had said it was the best 2 paragraphs in the entire module. He had said that's a high bar given the rest of the module's quality. She had laughed. He had been sincere. Harold Whitfield continued the Saturday trips without interruption. The October trip, 3 weeks after the Route 7 stop, went to the city's art museum. Harold had requested specifically that the museum educator include the gallery of African diaspora art in the tour, which he had been requesting for 2 years. The museum educator had finally built it into the tour after a conversation with Harold in which he had said simply, "These children need to see themselves." The educator had said, "You're right." She had built it in. The gallery visit lasted 38 minutes, which was longer than any other single gallery on the tour. The children had been still in a way that galleries rarely produce in groups of children. Harold had stood at the back. He had not hurried them. Lily was on the next Saturday trip and the one after that. By the fourth Saturday trip, she was no longer holding her lunch bag with both hands from the moment they got in the van. She was looking out the window. She had her hands in her lap, and she was looking out the window at the city going past, at the buildings and the people, and the particular variety of the world outside the van window, and she was taking it in with the full attention of a child for whom the world is still a place of continuous revelation. Marcus went on 4 more Saturday trips before he aged out of the home at 18. Each trip he sat in the first row on the left side and helped the younger children with their seat belts and explained to whoever was new what the Saturday trip was and where they were going. He had a way of describing things: the botanical gardens, the state park, the art museum, the geological timeline, that made them sound exactly as good as they were going to be without overselling them, which was a skill that Harold recognized as the same skill he tried to use in his sermons. He had told Marcus once, "You have a gift for description." Marcus had said, "I pay attention to what things actually look like." Harold had said, "That is the whole skill." Marcus had said, "It can't be the whole skill." Harold had said, "It is the foundation of all the others." Marcus aged out of this home in June of his 18th year. He enrolled in the community college in September. He came back to the home at 19 to volunteer for the Saturday trips. He sat in the first row on the left side and helped the younger children with their seat belts. He said to the ones who were nervous, "It's going to be good." He had been saying it for 3 years, and it had always been true. Lily went on the next 6 Saturday trips after the Route 7 morning. By the 3rd Saturday trip, she was no longer holding her lunch bag with both hands from the moment they got in the van. By the 6th, she was the one who knew where to look out the window for the first sign of the botanical gardens through the tree gap on the right side of Route 11. A mile before the parking lot exit, you could see the glass roof of the conservatory catching the light. She had discovered this on her second trip to the gardens and had told Harold on the way home, and Harold had said, "You found a landmark." She had said, "What's a landmark?" He had said, "It's a thing you notice that tells you where you are." She had thought about this. She had said, "I'm going to notice more of them." He had said, "I think you already are." Harold continued the Saturday trips. He serviced the van every 3 months at the church's small garage on schedule. He kept the notebook with the 217 names in his desk drawer. He added names. He kept a second notebook started in the same year for the children who came back, the ones who aged out and returned to volunteer, the ones who came to Calvary Baptist on Sundays, the ones who sent letters or cards or called the church office years later to say that the Saturday trips had mattered. The second notebook was thinner than the first, but it was growing. He expected it to eventually be thicker than the first. He intended to be there to see it become so. He preached on the Sunday after the Route 7 stop. His text was from Deuteronomy, the passage about care for the stranger, which Harold had preached many times in many forms for 23 years. He preached it that Sunday in the particular way that a pastor preaches a text that has just become personal, with the same words but with a different weight behind the words, the weight of something that has just happened and that the congregation already knows about, because news moves through a community the way news moves quickly and incompletely, and Harold intended to complete it. He said 12 children stood on the side of a road last Saturday. They were going to a museum to see the record of 4 billion years. They were stopped by a person who should have seen them as what they were, which was children in a church van going to a museum. They were not stopped because of what they were doing. They were stopped because of what I look like, and because of where we were going, and because some people have not yet learned to see a van full of children and a pastor in a ministry collar and think they are going somewhere good. He paused. The congregation was very quiet. He said they did go somewhere good. We got there 17 minutes late and we stayed until the museum closed. He said Lily asked 6 questions about the geological timeline. He said Marcus explained carbon dating to the child next to him because Marcus had looked it up the week before. He said if you ask me what they learned that day, I will tell you they learned that the Earth is 4 billion years old, and that everything in it has a record, and that the record is the thing that lasts. He said, I think that is the right lesson. I think that is what last Saturday was about. He stepped back from the pulpit. He looked at his congregation, the people who had been coming to Calvary Baptist for the 23 years he had been there, the ones who had come before him, the ones who were new. He said, we file the complaint, we document the record, we continue the work. He said that is what we do. He said the record is what lasts. He said we take the children to see the world and then we take them again. Harold watched Marcus from the driver's seat on the Saturday after Marcus came back to volunteer. Marcus was in the first row on the left side, helping the 6-year-old next to him with his seatbelt, explaining the locking mechanism with the specific patience of someone who has needed someone to do that for them, and remembers what it felt like to need it. Harold thought that boy already is something. He thought now he knows it too. He started the van. He checked the mirror. He pulled out of the Good Shepherd Children's Home parking lot onto Vance Avenue and drove toward Route 7. He drove at 60 miles per hour, exactly the speed limit, because that was the right thing, and the right thing was always the thing. In the back of the van, the children were talking. He could hear them through the mirror, the ordinary conversation of children on a Saturday morning on the way somewhere good, comparing what they remembered about where they were going, the younger ones asking the older ones about the last Saturday trip, Marcus explaining what the geological timeline gallery looked like from the entry, which was his best description from memory. In the second row on the right side, Lily had her face turned toward the highway. She was watching the exit signs as they passed. She was looking for landmarks. Harold drove the van. He drove it at 60 miles per hour on a clear Saturday morning, carrying 12 children to see 4 billion years of the Earth's record. The van had been the church's for 9 years. He had serviced it himself every 3 months. The oil was changed, and the tire pressure was correct, and the fluid levels were all where they needed to be, and the windshield was clean, and the children were in their seats, and Marcus was in the first row on the left, and Lily was in the second row on the right, and Dr. Patricia Huang was waiting at the Natural History Museum with the patience of someone who has been doing this for 11 years, and knows that the children arrive when they arrive, and that the job is to be there when they do. He took the exit. He drove the final mile to the museum. He found the parking space in the lot closest to the museum entrance. He turned off the engine. He said, "We're here." He said it to the children, and to the museum, and to the parking lot, and to the September morning that had started on a shoulder of Route 7 and had arrived 17 minutes late at the right destination. He had been saying, "We're here for 16 years." He intended to keep saying it. The children unbuckled. They gathered their things. They filed out of the van in the order they had learned to file out Marcus last helping the younger ones with the step. Harold stood at the side of the van and counted them as they came out, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. And then Lily, who was last because she had been looking out the window at the museum entrance and had not noticed the others had gone until Marcus said, "Lily, come on." 12. He counted 12. He said, "Let's go. Subscribe our channel. We follow the people who take 12 children to see the world."